right, well, it's 5 after. I think we've given people sufficient time to tune in and get past any unforeseen obstacles. And I'll, quickly introduce our guest, Carol Kammen. She probably is very well known to many of you. She's come and spoken to us at our breakfasts, at least on a couple occasions. And she's well known as the Tompkins County historian and has been a teacher in the community at Ithaca High School, TC3, in Cornell. And I guess fairly recently was recognized with the 2020 Lehman Prize for Distinguished Service from the
cool.
Academy of History. I'm looking at what the award actually is. The award is named for former New York State Governor Herbert H. Lehman and is given out annually to honor people with outstanding and lifelong contributions to New York State history. So,
wow.
And thanks for joining us.
Very nice, yeah.
I got the check, but I didn't get the medal because they had to cancel the dinner.
Maybe the medal's in the mail.
I doubt it. It was last April. Listen, I'm really glad to be talking to you. And I don't like it when people say they have good news and bad news, but I have good news and bad news. And it's the same thing. I've just finished a 90-page paper about ethnicity in Tompkins County. And that's the bad news too, because it means I've got way too much information. So what I want to do is just talk about things that have happened having to do with ethnicity in the county. But I really want to get you to think about what your role is. When did you come to the county? Was your family always here? Why have you stayed? And how do you identify yourself in terms of ethnicity? So when I was growing up, I knew I was Danish and Finnish and Austrian. And then when I was about 50, I found out I was Austrian Jewish, not just Austrian. And that was my background. My elder son married a Nigerian woman who was born in Israel and has a degree in medicine from Harvard. And so we have Nigerian in the family. And my younger son has married a woman from Indonesia, and they have Chinese in her family, mostly Indonesian, but Chinese. So we're a polyglot family, but I think we're also a family that represents the 21st century. Not that all families would be like mine, but it's sort of only possible the late 20th and the 21st century for this kind of mixture to happen. I think we have one more mixture than Barack Obama, because I counted. And so it's sort of an interesting thing to think about who was here in the past. And first there were the people of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, and they really were pushed out by an invasion and then by very difficult treaties that treated them not very well. So the Iroquois were not present when the first settling generation came in. From written records, there might have been a few here, but we don't really know about them. And when the first peoples came in, they were primarily white Protestants from Eastern New York or from New England. And then there were other people who had no identity whatsoever that we can figure out, but primarily it was a white population with a very few slaves and a very few but interesting free Blacks who came here right away because this was the frontier. So we had this interesting group of people here. And then by the 1830s, we began to have Irish people appear. And that becomes interesting because for me, the question was, when do 12 Irish men, mostly, appear and are needed in our labor force? And when do 36 Irishmen begin to be an influx? And there was anti-Irish feeling because there were too many of them. And because people thought they were different and couldn't be Americanized. And you'll recognize that language because we still hear it today, stupidly, but we still hear it today. And so we had the Irish come in, and by the 1850s, right before the Civil War, we had some Jews appear in the county. Very few, probably fewer than 12. Most of them came through as peddlers, but we know that in 1856, a woman by the name of Sarah Cohen came, and we know she's here because she and her infant baby, she died in childbirth, and she was buried right above the Ithaca City Cemetery. That was another trend of people who came here. The heavy migration years are really the years between 1880 and 1920, when there was upheaval in Europe and a lot of people began moving around because of religious persecution, because of economic failures, because of opportunities elsewhere, because some families had too many children and they simply needed to send them away because they couldn't take care of so many children. So we had in those years a number of Italians, especially, who first came here late 1880s up to 1914. And they mostly male, and they came in as laborers. And what the early Protestants had done to the early Irish, the Irish who are now established did to the Italians. They discriminated against them. So we have this pattern of people not accepting other people who don't speak the same language or cook the same things or have different religions. This idea that we don't accept each other is prevalent in our history as it is in American history. And after the Italians came in, and then they left in 1914 because Italy joined the First World War. And so most of the Italians left, and a few came back after that, and then established Italian groups in Ithaca. But we also had some other interesting people arrive, and no one arrived by coming directly to Ithaca. They came to New York, and then they went to Brooklyn, and then they went to Wilkes-Barre, and then they came here. It was always a migration of moving around. Nobody came that I can find came from Europe to go to Ithaca, except students. And right from the start, the opening of Cornell, we had students from foreign places. So in 1872, 2 years before Ezra Cornell died, he wrote in his day book that there were a lot of students here from foreign places like Canada, England, 2 from Russia, 1 from Bulgaria, several from the Caribbean, and the student population at Cornell has always been quite mixed. So that's interesting for us. And the students were always held somewhat differently or regarded somewhat differently than people who came here to work. Among the others who came along with the Italians were a number of Hungarians. Many of them lived in Groton and worked in as clerks and mechanics. The Italians came in and worked on our roads. They dug ditches. They ditched the creeks and lined them with stones so the creeks down in Ithaca wouldn't overflow. The Italians did a lot of very heavy, awful work. And they weren't paid well, and they weren't treated very well. Hungarians came in and did somewhat more interesting work, more mechanical work. We had Czechs who came in. We had Finns who came in, not from Finland, but from various places in the United States, like Upper Michigan and the Pacific Northwest, coming east in order to get cheap land in Spencer and Newfield. And so we had a sizable Finnish community. In fact, there was an auction in the town of Ulysses, and everyone stood around because some farmer had gone out of business and was auctioning off his land. And the man who won the auction was a Finn. And the auctioneer said to him, "You have to pay in cash," because he didn't look very wealthy. And the Finn took off his hat and counted out the money. And so people in the Ulysses and Newfield area got in their cars and their buggies, because this was in the 1918 years, and they went out to see the Finlander because they had never seen one before. So we regard people as labels, and we sometimes forget they're people. And this is a long trend. We also had a number of Syrians come in, or Lebanese. It's hard to tell what exactly to call them, but they came in from other mining areas and went to work at the International Salt Company in Lansing. And there still is there is one little street in Lansing where the Syrians still live today, but there also were some in the city. They came in to work in the mines, and they have an interesting history of their own. And then the Greeks came. The Greeks began coming in around 1910, and they didn't come in as laborers, and they didn't come in as farmers. They came in with skills in baking. And so they opened candy stores. And that gave them a very different relationship to the people who were already here, because you were directly buying candy from Mrs. Andrews. Some of you might remember Mrs. Andrews in the candy store. You're buying candy from Mrs. Andrews. You weren't just looking at a group of men working on a ditch. So there was a more of a closer relationship. And Americans have a very close and interesting relationship with Greek culture. We look back and say that our democracy is based on ancient Greece. We live in Ithaca. The town of Ulysses is next door. We live in an area where the predominant architecture of the 19th century was Greek revival. So there are a lot of things that were happening as people came in. What happened next is really interesting, because as people came in, there were reactions by those who were already here to newcomers. And the newcomers didn't look like them, they didn't talk like them, their food smelled funny. The Italians used garlic, and who used garlic in those days? There were all sorts of differences. And American law, starting in the 1880s, started to restrict who could come to this country. So my grandmother, who came in 1892 from Finland, could get in. But my husband's relatives from Russia couldn't get in till somewhat later. So our laws were limiting who could get in. You had to be healthy, you had to pay 50 cents, and then you had to pay $1. And after that, you had to pay $2 to get in. You had to be able to read and write in a language. It didn't have to be English, but you had to be able to read and write, and you had to be healthy. So our laws kept and you couldn't come in for purposes of prostitution. They didn't want that. So the laws somewhat changed. And in 1924, we passed the immigration restriction law. It's called the quota law, which said that the only number of immigrants who could come in from any ethnicity could be 2% of the number of that ethnicity in the 1880 census. And since there weren't a lot of people from Russia in the 1880 census, very few could get in. And there weren't a lot of people from Italy in 1880. So relatively few Italians could get in. And we restricted our immigration. And we did it to protect two things. We did it to protect who we thought we were, and we did it to protect the fact that immigrants would work for less, and they would therefore, the theory was, lower our standard of living. Now, both of these things are wrong, but that's what people believed. They believed it so much that immigrants were dangerous that Robert H. Treman, who gave us the parks and did a lot of philanthropy in town, got up one day in front of the big meeting of the Unitarian women and said, we have to be kinder to the immigrants among us because they're doing the work we don't want to do. And that echoes too today also. They're doing the work we don't want to do. We can be kind to them. They're good citizens. And that lets us know that we hadn't been kind to them. He wouldn't have had to say it if we had all been kind and friendly, but we hadn't been. And he made a point of saying this, which I found very interesting. The other interesting thing is that protesting the law of 1924 was a young representative from Manhattan named Emanuel Seller. And he said, that's a terrible law and I will live to see it torn down. Well, he did live to see it torn down. And in 1965, the United States passed the Hart-Celler Immigration Act that allowed people to come in as family groups, to join families, and for people with occupations that we needed. It opened up our immigration system. And it did it at a time when there was a lot of pressure in Europe from Russia, from the USSR, pushing at Czechoslovakia and Hungary and the Balkan states. And there was a lot of pressure elsewhere in the world. And people began to move. It became easier to move around the world, and people began to move around the world. So when 1965 opens up immigration, and I'm going to do this because it's allergy season, I'm sorry. Sorry. When 1965 opened up immigration, we began to see in Tompkins County people from various Asian countries. We began to see people in from South American countries, people who had never really been here before. We began to see people from Southeast Asia. And what happened after 65 was that we as a people and we as a county became more interested in seeing diversity as a positive thing than seeing it as a negative thing. This does not mean we have all been nice all down the generations. There has always been an anti-immigrant feeling in this country. Starting with the Know-Nothings in the 1830s, started in New York State. They didn't want immigrants, they didn't want Roman Catholics, they certainly didn't want Irish. And then there was an odd group called the OAR, the Order of the American Republic. And I only have one document about them. It was signed by Colonel Blood, who lived on East Buffalo Street. And it was against foreigners. And then, as you all know, during the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan was evident here. There weren't a lot of Klan members, except in 1924, there was a parade in Binghamton of 10,000 Klan members.
There you go. We really got it.
I'm not sure what that meant.
Keep going. That was a stray message coming in.
Okay, sorry. So there's always been an anti-immigrant feeling, and there's always been a feeling of ethnicity as something that we had to assimilate. But starting really in the 1970s, we began to see diversity as our strength. And for most people, especially in Tompkins County, we see those people of diverse backgrounds as bringing various strengths to us. various cultural ways of doing things to us. In the 1920s in Ithaca, there were restaurants that offered food. The first Italian restaurant in Ithaca opened in the 1930s. It was called Joe's, but it's not the Joe's you all know. It was a different Joe's, lasted for 2 years, and then Joe's opened in 1937, the Joe's you do know. And today, we have food from all different ethnicities, which I think is a way of looking at the acceptance and the appreciation of what's different, so that we can applaud that we are hyphenated Americans, that we are all displaced persons one way or another, that we are, that other people are not like us, but they are like us because we're all human beings. And I think for some of us, this is a very important aspect of who we are. So I guess the point of what I want to say is people come and their reaction is not always pleasant. People become part of the community and they often are harsh to the newcomers who come. And I think we've gotten over that, at least in our county, not everywhere. We now have a county that has not only a number of Protestant churches, and I think 6 Roman Catholic churches, we have a mosque, we have a monastery. We have the North American Monastery that is the headquarters for the Dalai Lama. We have a diversity here that I think makes us strong. And if you go to the Ithaca Parade, which we're not going to have this year, but the Ithaca Festival Parade really celebrates the diversity we have. And I see this as, in a world that's been pretty difficult for the last 4 years, for some of us, the last year for all of us, I see this as a way of our growing and becoming more accepting of other kinds of backgrounds. And we can celebrate those backgrounds and we can appreciate each other because of these different backgrounds. They bring something to us. They don't diminish us. And I think that's what E Pluribus Unum is all about. And we need more of it. Now, I want to ask you, what about your backgrounds? Anybody want to talk about a background? You don't. All right, that's fine.
I think that we have a couple takers
please.
there.
I'm Polish American. All of my grandparents came from Poland, although as someone once said to me, given how often Poland has been invaded, what does that really mean?
Right.
And I actually have a question about that. You mentioned about the literacy rules for immigration. And I'm certain that my grandmothers were not literate. One of my grandparents was, and I was just wondering if that changed over time. They came around the 1910 period.
I think the literacy rules. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I think the literacy rules applied mostly to men and to young people. We weren't worried about old yayas.
Oh, they weren't old when they came. They were teenagers. Yeah.
They were teenagers.
Yeah.
I don't know how it happened.
Mm.
People got in, and most people got in because there was a vetting of people before they got on the ship. The ship companies vetted people before they ever got to our shores, because if they were turned back, the ship companies like the Red Star and the White Star liners had to take them back at their own expense. So the shipping companies were vetting people first. And I don't know about I don't know if my grandmother, I guess, could read and write, but a lot of them didn't. Yeah.
Thank you.
Was there another question?
Myra, did you want to share your background?
My parents came to Ithaca as Cornell's undergraduates. From my father from Western New York, my mother from Haddonfield, New Jersey, near Philadelphia. But my mother loved family history, and she discovered in her family, her maiden name, Davis, is Welch. And so she's always proud of her Welch ancestry, but you could never find anything about her father's father, John Davis. There were too many John Davis
Mhm.
in the Revolutionary War. So she stopped researching the Davis line, but she did a lot for the Fincher line, my dad, a Fincher. And the first Fincher in our relations, there are lots of Finchers that are not our relations, but the first Fincher in our relations was a Glover in Worcester, England. And he was caught for praying in the streets of Worcester and asked to leave Worcester. And this is the story that was recorded in some literature my mother found when she was doing her research, that Benjamin Franklin gave the first Fincher who came from Worcester, England, Francis Fincher, he sold him 30 acres in Philadelphia to start a home in Philadelphia, but he didn't stay in Philadelphia. And one of my sisters said, why didn't he keep those 30 acres? They'd be very valuable to him. But
Over time.
he moved on, and this was 1683.
Mhm.
And he moved on to New England. So the Finchers that dispersed in the United States that are relatives are from the New England area.
But we're still all immigrants.
I feel like an immigrant, yes.
Right. I think the other thing I found when I was doing this research is that it's easy to call a group a group. So it's easy for me to say Irish, but the Irish themselves are not just one group. They represent many different facets. And so while the Protestants looked at the Irish as one group, they really were several. And the same can be said of American Blacks, who are not a monolithic group, but there are many divisions between them. So my talking about groups makes it sound easy, but the groups themselves are disparate in many ways. The Italians who came to Ithaca came from two different cities in Italy. And in Ithaca, they had relatively little to do with each other. And one Italian woman said to me, well, I didn't play with the girls from the other town. So this divides happen not only between those who are here and those who come, but the divides also happen among people themselves for all sorts of reasons. One of the interesting divides has to do with the fact that the earliest Black people here formed the AME Zion Church, which is the American Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, which was a denomination founded in 1824 in New York City. And over time, that was the main church. But by the 1890s, new Black people had come to the community. They were of the Baptist persuasion. So they formed the Calvary Baptist Church on North Albany Street. So to say the Blacks do this or the Italians do that is really misleading. It's just that in order to get this 90-page essay done, I did that a lot of times just to make it easier for myself. But I think ethnicity was difficult for people at different times. The Italians were certainly had prejudice against them because they were poor, they're mostly illiterate, they were brought here to do work, and most of them went home before the First World War. Other people came, but came in different waves, and they came looking for different things. And for German Americans, suppressing the fact that they were German was something that a lot of them wanted to do during the First and Second World Wars. But we have all seen that we're people, and we now can recognize the differences between us. And there was in Congress in 1972, a bill passed called the Ethnicity Act. And it gave money to school systems to promote languages, foreign languages and foreign cultures in the school systems in this country, which changed how people began to think of it. But I think the hero in my story is Emanuel Seller, who protested the bill in 1924. And then in 1965, he got the bill rescinded and a decent immigration policy founded. We need a new policy. Emanuel Seller is not with us. I hope we have some good people leading us to a better policy. Anyway, I would love to answer questions if you have any. Yeah.
I have a question. I was wondering, I'm familiar with the 1924 immigration law, mostly in terms of Asians. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on how many different people were affected by, many different ethnicities were affected by that law.
In terms of Asians?
No, in terms, I mean, that's what I know. I don't really know much about how else the law affected people.
Oh, well, the 24 law restricted the number of people per ethnic group who could come. And they based the number of people, I think it was 100 people could come after 1924 from Finland, but not more than 100 to the entire country. Because what we were doing was we were restricting the newer immigrants. We were preferencing the people from the British Isles, from Scandinavia, from Germany, France, and the Low Countries. And everyone else was getting a very low figure. And you had to petition to get into the country after 24. And so our immigration rates went way down. The numbers of people who came into the country. And then of course we had World War II when they weren't a lot of people. After World War II, we began to respond first to the Chinese, allowing, getting rid of the Chinese exclusion acts, allowing the Chinese to come and those who were here to have citizenship and to be able to vote. And then we opened up, especially as the communists pushed onto the eastern part of Europe, because people were fleeing all those countries that the Russians were taking over. And so something that happened in Eastern Europe affected Tompkins County because that number of those people came here. They went elsewhere too, but our immigration numbers went up after 65 and after the Second World War. So we let in displaced persons after the Second World War. Our record is not good. It is not as humane as we think it should be, but that's what we've done. And I think we need to know what we've done in the past and maybe be better next time. Wait, thank you so much for letting me talk to you.
Well,
And aren't you glad you didn't get all 90 pages?
I'm actually kind of curious because I've done a number of cemetery tours with Historic Ithaca and or the History Center. So when we're looking at the areas that were predominantly Italian, for example, it may not really be a good representation if so many people actually left, like the Irish that went back, or people who went back to, instead of staying, they were here for a number of years, but ended up leaving.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. Our cemeteries reflect the people who died here, who were here when they died.
Right.
But a lot of people came, and Ithaca and Tompkins County was not always a good place for them. So as many places as they had been before they came here, many of them went on to other places, and they were replaced by other people coming here. Tompkins County had the reputation back in the 1830s as being a most fluctuating place. And our population, partially due to Cornell and Ithaca College, but our population has always moved in and out. And there are relatively few families who were here in, let's say, 1820, who are still here. Opportunity was not always here. There were articles in the newspaper that said, why would young men stay here? Because we pay such low wages, they can't get ahead. We didn't have a lot of good land. Most of the good land is in the north part of the county, not the south. If you wanted land, you had to go elsewhere. There was the Oregon Trail and the idea of the gold fields in California. People left. As much as they came, people left. And I have records of people who left as early as 1832. Writing back home, you should come here because in Ohio, the land is as flat as your kitchen floor, but living in Caroline, you're on a hill. And why don't you come here where there's good land? There's always been the lure of other places. And I think basically the human race has always moved. We have always been on our feet, moving to the next place. We moved out of Africa. We spread from Africa across into Asia and into Europe. We have always been on the move. And I think it's political. I think it's for human betterment. I think it's religious. I think it's because some people are just are itchy, have itchy feet. There are a lot of reasons, but that's a good point. Thank you.
And then I also want to ask if you're involved in the bicentennial from the town of Ithaca. The stories they've been doing on site that some of the people have put up. Like I just got done the Newfield generations, for example, the people who had their pictures taken and talked about how long they've been here and what they were doing.
This is the Robin Wishna project.
Right.
Yep.
I just wondered if you were involved with it at all also, because I think of you as having your hands in all the history pies.
I wish I did. I don't.
Okay.
I was the first person Robin interviewed, and so I'm part of that. And
I haven't read yours yet.
But as you know, it's also the centennial for Enfield, and it's the centennial for the town of Ulysses, splitting into thirds. So it's an interesting year. Yeah.
Neat.
Question, Carol, this 90-page paper
Yep.
going to be published somewhere where, if we wanted to look at it, where would that?
Well, not yet. It's being read and critiqued, and I'm getting out the kinks. I've done it with a woman by the name of Elaine Engst, who was the archivist for Cornell, and it will probably be brought out by the Tompkins County Historical Commission, and it will be available at the History Center and other places. I don't know where the other places are yet, but it will be a pamphlet. The Historical Commission has brought out a pamphlet called Explaining Tompkins that our former county administrator wrote for the 20th century. And it talks about how Tompkins physically got together and then how Tompkins is governed. And it's a wonderful thing. We've also brought out something called Living in Tompkins. And this is essays people have written about why they're here and what they do here. And there is a book coming out by, I hope, June, that Historic Ithaca is doing called Permanent Residence, about some of the people buried in our cemeteries.
Neat.
So we've got a lot going on. But I don't have fingers in all pie. I don't have enough fingers. Thank you, but I'm so glad that we have so much going on. It's wonderful that I only came here in the 1960s, that we all have part of what this county is all about. And that we will leave something for the people who come next. And I think that's important. Thank you, Zach.
Well, thank you. We appreciate it.
Anytime.
Well, okay, we'll take you up on that soon. Keep me appraised of what's going on in your research. But
Okay.
thank you all. And Carol, you got a second after everybody gets off? I have a couple questions for you. 5 minutes.
Sure.
Okay. So thanks for tuning in, everyone. Remember, if you want to join the mural walk tomorrow, 1 p.m. over by the Alex Alley Pool. And hopefully we'll see you then. If not, sometime later on in the month. So take care.
Friday for poetry.
Oh, poetry on Friday, right? Okay.
Thanks, Zach.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Bye.
Thanks, Carol.